Dear organizers, thank you for having me here. I enjoyed it a lot. And I'm here to make a quite a provocative claim, which, as I see now after the previous panel, maybe don't really fit, but maybe there would be an intellectual challenge to discuss the thing. And the topic is Don't Save the Planet, the romantic perspective on the ecological crisis. And as you just heard, I'm mostly speaking Schelling, German idealism, and I'm coming from the romantic side of philosophy. So it's not my claim that we should not save the planet. I want to make it very, very clear. That's the claim of German romanticism. But still, I think that we can learn a lot from this perspective since we're discussing contemporary topics. And for the opening, I'm kindly ask you to join me to, so to say, a thought experiment. You see two pictures here. The one I took 2 days ago, staying at the central station in Duisburg, so it's quite terrible. And the second one, the link side, if I'm correct, right. The link side is a picture I took, as you see, in mountains in Österreich, so it was an amazing experience. It was a philosophical conference, and I want you to do a thought experiment in 2 steps. First, I want you to think, what are the structures you see in these pictures? Who made it? Like how they're structured? How they shaped in your mind? And after you got some impression about the structures, I ask you to think, where would you feel more calm? Where would you probably experience freedom and feeling that you're not in a conflict with nature? I mean, as a very melancholic person, I know that it could be you can feel very bad, even it's the most beautiful place on earth, but, well, we're talking serious, so I think you get to the point. We'll turn back to this idea, but now I'm switching to the heavy stuff, so chatting. I'm doing metaphysics and very, very old stuff, but it happened that a colleague with whom I share the office at Radboud University is doing Schelling and eco-crisis, so we've been talking eco-crisis for 2 years, and I've got a lot of thoughts and ideas from him, and we discussed a lot this narrative, which is quite common, and even in the program we see that it's one of the major narratives in philosophy. That's the narrative you can attract grants or funding, and so that's a hot topic. Save nature, save planet, save the earth, it's really a hot topic. But what is common? That would be my question from Schellingian perspective. What is common for all this narrative, like let's save planet, let's save nature, let's save the earth? So at first, they point to a crisis, the hashtag of the conference. They point to a crisis, specifically to an ecological crisis that we are inevitably facing. The second point is that all these narratives imply that nature is seen as something to be saved. And that will be the crucial point for German romanticism. So nowadays we think of nature as an object or something which should be saved. And this also implies that we can see a certain relationship between nature and a man. And my question, and the story I want to trace today in front of you, is what are this relationship and how contemplating on the relationship between nature and a man could really change our perspective, even to those questions. So, as a first step, I made a tiny investigation. Like, I spent 2 years of 2 hours, sorry, not 2 years, only 2 hours of intense Googling. What are like the most prominent books which are dedicated to the topic Save the Planet? And I see a clear tendency which I want to share. So on the first hand, on the one hand, we see multiple Save the World manuals. And they are, I'm sorry, quite stupid, but anyways, most of them, I'm not completely judging the books. It's nice to have something on your bookshelf, but basically they are asking us to be very careful, to not overuse plastic, to download another app or whatever. Or they probably will refer to many apocalyptic scenarios. Like, if you don't save nature, we will all die. Or if you're a person, you have to save the planet because that's how you're heroic. Stuff like that. If we try to dive any deeper, then we're facing books which are way more interesting. But those are about philosophical analysis. And if you just literally scroll your attention from left to the right, you see that it's so diverse. For example, in the first book, which I find quite nice, it's Who Would You Kill to Save the Planet? It's about cinema and apocalyptic scenarios and saving the planet narrative, or Justice for Animals, or how, for example, how you should, in this Mark Kuckelberg book, how you should not overuse or use different apps to help you to control. For example, he discussed an app which draws your attention that you have to drink enough water, but after that you have to be careful with the glass. You have to throw it very carefully in the right place. And well, that's very diverse. For example, direct ecology from Timothy Morton definitely stays aside. But basically, I cannot say if it's like really educating, because it's a reading for philosophers. But if we are trying to explain what Timothy Morton says, for example, to a government to really improve the situation or to contribute to the narrative, I don't really think that they will buy it. So the situation is, as you see, quite green, nice, diverse, and quite hopeless simultaneously. That's why I decided that maybe it's a good step to step back to Schelling and romantic perspective. But before going to Schelling, because I know that it's not the philosopher you all familiar with, and I should not expect that, I made a very brief manual of how philosophy, metaphysics treat the idea of nature. Maybe one of the most prominent scenarios is about harmony of a man and a nature. And it's, of course, Stoics who claim that we live in a harmony with nature. But it's quite difficult to rely on Stoics. That's why all the self-help manuals we can find on bookstores, like How to Be Stoic or so on, that could probably help us to gain the right attitude towards nature, why they fail, because Stoics did not really have capitalism, and they didn't really had to face what we are facing in terms of wars and Atomwaffen, stuff like that. It's way close to what we have now if we even turn into the Middle Ages, because in the Middle Ages we see an ambition to know nature, an ambition to deal with it. But this ambition to know nature is basically the ambition to know God, because in the Middle Ages we tend to know nature as a middle-aged person. I might be interested to study nature because according to the common framework, it would be a divine product of God. Hence, if I'm studying nature, if I'm interested in nature, I'm basically studying God. This ambition was extended in the modern age because knowledge is power, but now we know nature not because it's divine and created by God. We don't know. We don't want to know the good by knowing nature. What we want to know about nature is what is nature about. Hence, we can control, fight it, structure it as we want to. For example, if we know nature, we probably can build something like a Duisburg-Bahnhof seen on the first picture. But you see that I highlighted Immanuel Kant and post-Kantian philosophy because I think that the most danger and the source of the origin of all the narratives we are facing is basically hidden there. We read from Kant. I'm sorry, I promised some funny stuff, but I think it's funny. It's not that, should not be that challenging. Kant says in the Kritik der reinen Vernunft, we have two expressions, world and nature, and which are sometimes used together. The first signifies the mathematical whole of all appearances and the totality of their synthesis. The same world is called nature insofar as it's considered as a dynamic whole. What Kant is saying us, is telling us, is that basically we have absolutely no access to nature. We cannot know it. We only deal with structures, narratives, natural laws, etc. But what nature is about and what is the true relation between man and nature, that's thing we cannot know. And my claim is, I will comment on that in the next slide as well, that that's the common point for all the eco-narratives, because they completely, most of them are completely missing the stoic relationship, the initial one, between a man and a nature. And since Kant, and it was a continuation of the modern age thing and approach, since Kant we completely lost the idea of how a human being is indeed related to nature. Post-Kantian philosophy offered a significant criticism of this account. And so I don't really think that, well, you had some time to scroll the slide, and maybe it's not, I'm not going to take a lecture on history of philosophy anyways, but let us contemplate a bit more, about the danger of this Kantian approach. Again, according to Kant, nature is existence of things, das Dasein der Dinge, insofar as it is determined by general laws, which again means that natural laws are only the laws our faculty of understanding or our cognitive structure can grasp. So without our cognitive abilities, without our own mind and how it structures the world, there is no way how we can get any closer to the understanding of nature, a man, and the connection between them. As you know, Kant was a proponent of the idea that thinking is important and that the thinking is difficult. So says Schelling, who was extremely critical about Kantian idea that the faculty of understanding, the faculty which makes up all the narratives, how we're talking of nature. This faculty, reflection, speculation, the faculty of understanding, in this particular quote, it's reflection, it was the main target of Schelling's criticism on Kant. Let's read together the quote. But because in reflection, or in thinking, as he would say, it's possible to conceive of attractive and repulsive forces, so he's referring to Newton and Kant, as distinct from matter. People suppose that what can be separated in thought is also separated in facticity. The mere reflection, so if we think too much, if we overthink, if we overproduce in the eco-narratives, for example, mere reflection, therefore, is a spiritual sickness in mankind. The more so where it imposes itself in domination over the whole man and kills at the root what in germ is his highest being, his spiritual life. And here is the danger. It makes that separation between man and the world permanent. So if Schelling would go to a bookstore and see all these narratives, I would say he would be very terrified by this over narration about how we can save and deal with natural crisis. Now I only offered the criticism, like what he disliked in Kant. But young Schelling also proposed a positive solution. And that's exactly the perspective I think we can learn a lot from. Schelling was quite young, I think maybe like in his 30s, where he had to go for a very strange vacation in Leipzig. He worked as a private tutor, so that was basically a coincidence because initially Schelling was a Kant nerd, so he only read Kant, Plato, and he didn't really study natural sciences. But because he was a tutor, he had to attend lectures on natural sciences. And that's how he learned a lot about the contemporary theories, what we today call biology, and all this stuff. It was a huge inspiration, and that he got to know Goethe, and the connection was very inspiring for both. But that's how he came to this very interesting and remarkable text, Ideen zu einer Philosophie der Natur, Ideen for Philosophy of Nature, where he tries to do a very strange thing. On the one hand, combines the Platonic and Kantian approach towards nature, on the other hand, to put it on a metaphysical track. So, in a very Platonic or even Stoic fashion, he says that initially there was no opposition between a man and the world. Human beings lived in a philosophical state of nature. It was an absolute equilibrium of forces, constitutive forces of nature, by the way, and of consciousness. But this equilibrium was upset by man. You know why? Because we started thinking. That's what Schelling said. So reflection, thinking, is the first step, how we gain all these narratives, but simultaneously is a step which makes a gap, a kluft, so the separation between us and nature, terrifyingly huge. His positive proposal is a very, so to say, shaped in a romantic fashion. He says that the final goal of all natural sciences is knowledge of the absolute unity which embraces the whole. In nature, therefore, Schelling says, the whole absolute is knowable, also appearing nature products only successively and in endless development. So he says that, yeah, of course, we have nature as natural laws. We indeed locked, this intellectual trap, that's for sure. But what can help us to restore this initial equilibrium, the absolute, is what he will later call freedom, but now he's calling it the absolute, in this idea that we are, as human beings, although we are producing these narratives, we still can make a step back, or maybe it would be even more correct to say a step up towards the absolute, and see that nature is not only about conditions. And for Schelling, that had to change the whole perspective and the whole urge for us to do, to commit. I mean, maybe it's a bit more speculative, but once the perspective is shifted, once we are tending to know nature and the absolute in this romantic fashion, for Schelling that would mean that we grasp this initial relationship between man and the world, which also means that we are not interested in doing things which are leading us to crimes, to ecological crisis itself, and hence to all these narratives. So, of course, it might sound a bit mystical. Like it looks like I'm offering you to don't act and to read Schelling and trying to see nature as an absolute, and even without knowing what the absolute is about. That's why I should comment on the term a bit. The absolute for Schelling is the idea of the unconditional, which means that all the narratives and all the laws of nature we're facing or we're producing, all these narratives are conditioned because we have to have a certain relation between A and B, subject and object, whatever. It's always a dualism. Schelling claims that because we are free, because there is always consciousness, a pure consciousness, we can see that all the conditionals, and that's his famous transcendental argument and the Kantian transcendental argument as well, we can only see conditions if we have an opportunity to step back to the unconditional. And the unconditional in nature for Schelling, that's how he portrayed it, and in the text I've mentioned the ideas. The unconditioned in nature is exactly what we see if we are, for example, as biologists, examine an organism. And for the unconditional, for this freedom and this perspective he offers, it's very important that an organism, exactly as the absolute and the unconditional, is self-organizing structure. It's self-freewilling structure, and it has a formative power, or formative powers, Triebe, or drives. And hence, Schelling concludes, organism, and we can prove it like by studying natural sciences, natural being and nature are basically capable for self-recovering. So, and you see where I'm going. If nature can recover itself, the romantic perspective would be just don't touch it. Don't do things which make nature worse or feeling worse if we assume that there is a certain subjectivity or freedom in nature. And then, as a living organism, and we are a tiny part of this organism, it will recover itself. Just please don't make any crimes. That would be a romantic perspective. Yeah? And the unconditional in thinking is self-positing. So if you would say, why are you so sure, or for example, Schelling, why are you so sure that an organism can recover itself? Then he would say, okay, but let's consider the same structure in your mind. You can say I, out of what? Out of your pure consciousness, out of nowhere, basically. And that's exactly the self-formative power, self-positing, freedom, or self-recovering. It's this absolute self-recovery circle. So, in this way, the perspective to save the planet for Schelling or for the romantic tradition would be, first and foremost, the perspective of the unconditionality. And, so that would be, again, back to these pictures, right? So what we see here to the right is a pure series of conditions. And whenever you're dealing with something which is made by people, you always see that you are not really free from that because you are surrounded by materialized conditions. Whereas when you're seeing nature, you don't have this. You see that you are basically surrounded of the absolute itself, of the pure unconditionality. You don't have to make any actions for nature just to be. And imagine that the cleaning guy will not clean the central station for a day or two. It will be a catastrophe. So the point Schelling or romantic philosophy would make that you have, once you're dealing with conditions in the city or in the nature, you have to be responsible for this condition. You have to act. You have to do something for the conditions. Whereas you have to do absolutely nothing for nature to be. And even this step is extremely elucidative if once we're starting to think about what is the urge for us, where does the urge of all these debates come from? It's apparently my email, but I wanted to say that, well, this is how you can refer to Schelling. So if you have some question to Schelling, yeah, please ask them. Don't save nature too much. I would find a sort of balance between the contemporary debates and what I offered from Schelling's perspective. Don't over-save nature. That would be my final claim. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you. Well, thank you for this provocative talk. I'm not sure I agree with your conclusion. But what you're pointing to, I think, bears discussion, namely that all the talk about ecological crisis, climate change, blah, 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 apocalypse, depends on a vision of nature, on a certain understanding of nature that maybe philosophically is up for rethinking. And especially if we didn't quite see it in your genealogy, but maybe I can add to it a little bit, that, right, that this early modern view of nature, or the view of nature that we inherited from early modern science, which is this break, what you call the philosophical way out of the state of nature, or out of the philosophical state of nature, right? This understanding of a conflict or tension, or our opposition with nature, that we are different from nature. To what extent that's a modern idea and not, say, a biblical idea? I think we can talk, but the issue is, how could we rethink our relationship to nature? You know, what would rethinking that relationship or changing that view on a conceptual level? Yeah. What would it take to do that, and then what would be the consequences of it, right? The ecological emergency people, right, they take this early modern science view, which you called extractivist, whatever, capitalist, and invert it and says, yes, we are responsible for this disaster, and so we have to be custodians and do something about it. And so that seems to me like a positive thought, right? That we should be actually acting responsibly to nature. And what you propose here does not strike me as very responsible, right? Just don't worry, go on, make a mess, extract. Okay. Nature will heal itself. You see what I'm going?
Yeah, I see, but again, so I've tried to, indeed sketch and provoke what would be the perspective of the, let me say, 18th, 19th century. So they did not have such a terrible situation that time. I mean, at least that seems for us to be like that. But I would say that you just mentioned it. So once we realize that there is a certain dependence, and once we reflect on that, then we would indeed have to make actions. But those actions for me, would not necessarily or exclusively deal with the eco-narrative. For example, what could be done? This particular relation should be taught at schools, for example. We can do, or I remember a gorgeous talk from early morning about the Indians praying to the sun. Yeah, so I mean, there are things, and I'm not a sociologist or person who could invent a certain strategies of how to show people that they are already made these over-reflection steps, and that already led to a catastrophic state. And people tend to think that that's all because the reason. But Schelling would say that's because of the faculty of understanding, because this mechanism of thinking, right? So the pure reason would rather tend us to fight capitalism, for example, to get another education system which would highlight that reason, in contrast with this faculty which produces laws and narratives, has a restrictive power, so we basically want more than we need and stuff like that. But it should be people who make it for the society. But what philosophers can do, they can provoke and highlight this relationship you just talk. No way I'm telling don't do anything and just throw all your garbage out of your window. No. But on the contrary, I would rather ask people not to go for an eco vacation and sit home and read Schelling. I mean, if it would be my educational proposal.
Thank you, Anna, for this interesting talk. I didn't find it too provocative, to be honest. Simply in the sense that I understand.
It's because you read Hegel.
Well, not just Hegel.
At least Hegel.
But I actually wanted to ask you a question about Spinoza, but wanted to comment first on this question of saving nature. Simply in the way I understand your gesture is that if we put ourselves in the position of the saviors of nature, we are already committing the very same mistake that brought us to the position which we are in.
Mm-hmm.
This is how I understood
Absolutely.
your general sort of thrust, and this is why I don't see it as super provocative. It's only provocative on the surface of it. Yeah. It reminds me also of how, well, I'll use his name, of how Heidegger,
oh no,
sorry, of how he sees the whole problem of herausfordern, which he wants to turn into hervorbringen. Yeah. So I think it's a very classical philosophical position with regards to nature. But my actual question was, how do you see Spinoza's relationship with Schelling specifically? Some of the formulations you put in the quotations remind me very much of Spinoza, actually. But what I find really interesting in Spinoza is that he doesn't begin with this great difference between man and nature. Quite to the contrary. There's absolutely no difference between man and nature, in some sense, in Spinoza. So have you explored this sort of...
Yes, I have a tiny chapter on Schelling and Spinoza, but I wouldn't say that I'm an expert. I know that there is this gorgeous book, Schelling and Spinoza, by I forgot the name. I can link. I mean, you probably know the book with a black cover. So the thing is that Schelling, especially early Schelling, is super critical about Spinoza. He's like, wow, Spinoza made for Schelling what David Hume made for Kant. I think it's sort of a weakness from the dogmatic sleep or something like that, because of course Schelling was inspired by an attempt to overcome this dualism between a man and a nature. But Schelling thinks that this God in Spinoza does not really allow freedom, because, as I get for my research purposes, the main argument, that in Spinoza, there is no such a clear difference between good and bad, because between evil and the good. And Schelling, who already even practically faced a lot of revolution, technical progress in a way, because there were plenty of discoveries of magnetism, electricity, and the world was changing definitely at Schelling's time. I think he had experienced this tension, and think that's what Spinoza is missing for Schelling, is this tension of good and evil in this unity. Because in Schelling, this tension is, although not explicitly there, but implicitly, and once we're acting, it's revealing. It's not like that in Spinoza. We cannot really, as I get Schelling's argument, we cannot really trace this relationship between the good and the evil.
Thank you. I'm coming not from the academia, but from the environmental movement perspective. And
I should run.
And I definitely agree about the, I mean, maybe not from the, we'll see. Agree with the criticism about this like saving perspective, and multiple environmental organizations contributed to that, showing pictures of like polar bear like on the melting ice and stuff like that. This kind of cutization of nature, which is nice but also cruel sometimes. So it's like super important, like not to kind of be in this patronizing role. And this here, I agree with this. This is problematic also when we're thinking about the solving the issue. So the kind of environmental justice movement sees it's more like not saving the nature, but more like resisting destruction of nature. And here's also we have to admit that like most of us here are products of European civilization, and everything that was presented also, that's that perspective. And also the civilization that in a bigger scale created this crisis we are in. So we also, it's not about saving, it's more maybe about taking responsibility for that. And another thing, it's also like when we saying, and I mean, when we saying mainly like a man or a civilization that did something, we need, or at least environmental justice movement reminds about bringing kind of political analysis or class analysis maybe. It's not like everyone is equally responsible for creating this problem, and not everyone should be like contributing solving that. So there's like not just a man or a civilization, there are structures that created and contributed to this, and it's not about like individuals for sure. It's about some structures, economies that contributed to that. So there are also maybe like a different perspectives on nature, like from Global South, for example, from indigenous knowledge. They definitely gives us different perspective and different approach to solving the issue. But yeah, in general, I agree with that.
I think it's clear the question. Please give the chance for last question. We could ask you just shortly answer the question.
Thank you so much. Amazing talk and absolutely fascinating topic for me. I have a question. Well, the mind as nature is also like a reproducing self-organizing entity. Mm-hmm. So I would understand like not saving the nature or like treatment of nature in the way that there's supposed to be some sort of co-creation, like not just leave the nature alone, but as the mindful beings, we are kind of supposed to be like in this constant co-creation with nature, and it's like very natural. But there are also another thing then is that maybe it's not that we need to save nature, but that we need to save this the idea of nature as the unconditional, because what is often saved in the in this kind of green perspectives is not kind of nature, but the environment that is like the sum of the separated objects that are not a coherent, self-organizing, growing, and always changing entity. So I just wanted to ask what you think on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're running out of time. I just say that it's a gorgeous comment. Right, you're absolutely right. It's all about, it's not saving nature in terms of let's avoid any acting on, for example, how the ongoing wars destroy forests, or for example, or ecosystem. No, it's only about the idea we have to cherish, we have to protect, that we are capable of things, the idea of the unconditionality in nature. And in referring to the question before you, it's indeed about, because once people are getting into this Save the Planet manuals, as they call them, they are getting the false impression as if they were saving or acting or doing something. No, that's not how it works. But they're feeling better about themselves. They're enjoying themselves. They first have a nice cover on the bookshelf. Secondly, they thinking that they're contributing. No, it's all about this very deep level, which should start off from education system or even, I don't know, even earlier, that what is civilization, the whole world is missing is the idea of the conditions. That would be my ultimate thank you for it. I'm eagerly agree.
Okay. Thank you. No. That's